wishing well sat in Betty Lou Beets' front yard for nearly 2 years. Neighbors would compliment it when they drove past, admiring the decorative brickwork and the flowers she'd planted around it. It looked peaceful there, sitting among the roses and petunias, catching the afternoon sun like any other garden feature in East Texas. But underneath the concrete and brick, wrapped carefully in plastic, lay the body of Jimmy Don Beets, a Dallas Fire Department captain who'd been shot twice in the head by the woman who promised to love him until death did them part. Betty didn't just kill Jimmy, though. She turned murder into a routine, a solution to problems that most people solve with divorce papers. Over 20 years, she married 6 times, and at least 2 of those husbands never made it out alive. The others survived only because her aim wasn't good enough, or because luck intervened at the right moment. By the time police finally discovered what she'd been doing, her backyard had become a graveyard, and the sweet-looking grandmother who waved at neighbors had transformed into one of Texas's most notorious serial killers. This is the story of how Betty Lou Beets fooled everyone for decades, how she almost got away with it, and how her own children finally brought her down. It's about greed wrapped in the disguise of domestic normalcy, and it raises questions that still don't have easy answers today. The house near the lake sat quiet that Saturday evening, isolated from neighbors by stretches of East Texas countryside. Inside, 3 people occupied the modest home: Betty Lou Beets, her 5th husband Jimmy Don Beets, and her son Robert Branson. The TV flickered in the corner while Jimmy relaxed in his recliner after a long week working as a Dallas firefighter. He had no idea that his wife had been planning his death for weeks, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. Betty called Robert into another room sometime that evening. She looked him straight in the eye with a cold expression he'd seen before. "I'm done with Jimmy," she told her 19-year-old son. Robert assumed she meant divorce, but Betty's next words shattered that assumption entirely. "Jimmy has to die tonight." No tears came from her eyes. No emotion flashed across her face. She stated it matter-of-factly, as if discussing tomorrow's weather or what to make for dinner. Then she instructed Robert to leave the house, to drive away, and come back in a couple hours. Robert didn't argue or question her. He didn't call the police or try to talk his mother out of what she was planning. He simply walked out the front door, got in his car, and left his stepfather alone with a woman who'd already decided he would never see another sunrise. Inside the house, Jimmy Don Beets dozed peacefully in his favorite chair. At 46 years old, he'd built a solid career with the Dallas Fire Department, rising to the rank of captain through years of hard work. He'd married Betty the previous year, believing he'd found someone to share his life with. The heart medication he took daily sat on the counter nearby. The fishing boat he loved stood ready at the marina for weekend trips. Everything in his life seemed normal, settled, and comfortable. Betty walked into the living room carrying a .38 caliber pistol. She raised it with steady hands and fired twice. Both bullets struck Jimmy in the head, killing him instantly. He slumped forward in the recliner, blood pooling beneath him, his life ending in the same chair where he'd watched countless evenings of television. Betty stood there for a moment, looking at what she'd done. No panic seized her, or any sign of regret on her face. She'd solved her problem, and now she just needed to clean up the mess. 2 hours passed. Robert returned home just as his mother had instructed, and he found Betty waiting calmly in the kitchen. Jimmy's body still sat in the recliner where he'd died. "Help me get rid of the body," Betty said, and Robert obeyed. Together, the mother and son carried Jimmy's corpse out to the front yard, where a decorative wishing well stood among the flowers. Jimmy and Robert had built that well together just months earlier, during their happier times. Now it would serve as Jimmy's final resting place. They lowered the body into the brick-lined pit, wrapped it carefully, and sealed it with the same bricks Jimmy had helped lay. Then they poured concrete over everything, sealing the well shut. When they finished, the structure looked exactly as it had before, just another garden decoration that made the property look homey and cared for. Nobody would ever suspect what lay beneath those pretty bricks unless they knew where to look. Betty's work wasn't finished yet, though. She needed to explain Jimmy's disappearance, to create a story that would keep investigators from looking too closely at her or her property. So she and Robert drove to the marina where Jimmy kept his fishing boat. Betty put some of Jimmy Don's heart medication in his fishing boat the next day, making it look like he'd been taking his pills before disaster struck. Robert removed the boat's propeller to simulate a mechanical failure. Then they pushed the boat into the lake and let it drift away. Another piece of the elaborate lie Betty was constructing. The next morning, Betty called the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. Her voice trembled with the perfect amount of worry as she reported that Jimmy had gone fishing the previous day and never returned home. She sounded exactly like a concerned wife should sound, scared and confused, hoping for good news, but fearing the worst. The dispatcher assured her they'd send someone out immediately to begin searching. The boat washed ashore on August 12th near Redwood Beach Marina. Sheriff's deputies found Jimmy's fishing license inside, along with the medication. Everything pointed to a tragic accident. A middle-aged man with heart problems who'd suffered some kind of medical emergency while fishing alone. The propeller damage suggested mechanical trouble that could have stranded him on the water. Rescue crews immediately launched a massive search operation, dragging the lake with boats and diving equipment, while helicopters circled overhead from dawn to dusk. For 3 weeks, searchers combed Cedar Creek Lake looking for Jimmy Don Beets. His fellow firefighters from Dallas joined the effort, searching for their missing captain and friend. Divers plunged into the murky water again and again, finding nothing but lake bottom. Boats dragged the depths with specialized equipment designed to locate bodies. News crews covered the story, reporting on the search for the missing firefighter. Through it all, Betty played her part perfectly. She stayed home most days, acting like any grieving wife would act. When the fire department chaplain visited to offer comfort and support, Betty seemed appropriately distraught. But then she asked questions that struck the chaplain as odd. Instead of asking about the search efforts or whether they'd found any new leads, Betty wanted to know about Jimmy's life insurance policy. How much was it worth? When would she receive the money? What about his pension benefits? Would those transfer to her as his widow? The chaplain found these questions strange, coming from a woman whose husband had only been missing for a few weeks. Most spouses would be focused entirely on finding their loved one alive, not calculating financial benefits. But Betty had an explanation ready. She was just being practical, she said. I am planning ahead and making sure I could survive financially if Jimmy was really gone. The chaplain accepted this explanation, though something about it didn't sit quite right. Nobody suspected the truth. Nobody imagined that Jimmy's body lay buried just 50 feet from where Betty sat, asking about insurance money. The perfect crime had been committed, and Betty Lou Beets had gotten away with murder. Or so she thought. To understand how Betty became capable of cold-blooded murder, we need to travel back to her childhood in North Carolina. Betty Lou Dunavant was born on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her early years were fraught with tragedy and hardship from the very beginning. As a young child, Betty contracted measles. The illness ravaged her small body, and when the fever finally broke, she emerged deaf. The disease had damaged her hearing permanently, leaving her isolated in a world she could barely access. Growing up deaf in rural North Carolina during the 1940s meant limited opportunities, constant frustration, and a sense of being fundamentally different from everyone around her. But Betty would later claim that her deafness was the least of her childhood traumas. According to Betty's later testimony, her father sexually abused her throughout her childhood. She never reported this abuse at the time, or ever tell anyone what was allegedly happening behind closed doors. These claims only surfaced decades later, after she'd been convicted of murder and was fighting to avoid execution. Because of this timing, the truth of her allegations remains uncertain. Either she suffered in silence for decades, or she invented the abuse to gain sympathy from courts and the public. When Betty turned 12, her mother was committed to a psychiatric hospital. Suddenly, Betty found herself thrust into the role of parent. She had to care for her younger sister and brother while still being a child herself. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, made sure her siblings got to school, all while dealing with her own deafness and the trauma she claimed to be experiencing. Her childhood effectively ended that year, replaced by responsibilities no 12-year-old should have to shoulder. At just 15 years old, Betty married Robert Franklin Branson. She was barely more than a child herself, yet she immediately began having children of her own. Over the next 17 years, Betty gave birth to 6 kids with Robert. But their marriage was turbulent from the start, marked by constant fighting, breaking up, and getting back together in an endless cycle that finally ended in 1916 when they divorced for good. That's when Betty's real pattern began. She would eventually marry 6 different men in total, including Bill Lane, twice. And according to Betty's later claims, most of these men abused her physically and emotionally. But here's the problem with her narrative. She only made these abuse allegations after she'd been convicted of murder and sentenced to death. During the actual events, she never filed police reports about abuse. She never sought help from domestic violence organizations. She never told doctors or friends about being beaten. The claims only emerged when she desperately needed them for her appeals. Her second husband was Bill Lane, and Betty's relationship with him revealed the pattern of violence that would define her life. In one incident, Betty shot Bill twice, once in the stomach and once in the back. Bill survived both gunshots and later testified that he'd threatened to kill her first, which is why she'd shot him. Prosecutors never filed charges against Betty for shooting Bill, treating it as self-defense. Remarkably, Betty remarried Bill shortly after shooting him not once but twice. That second marriage lasted less than a month before they divorced again. Betty's criminal record grew throughout this period. She was charged with public lewdness, firearms violations, and other offenses that painted a picture of a woman with a violent temper who didn't follow society's rules. Her third husband, Ronnie Threlkeld, learned this the hard way in 1978, when Betty tried to run him over with her car. He survived, though, and like Bill Lane, he would later testify against Betty at her murder trial. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. Betty married men, things went bad, and violence inevitably followed. But her husbands kept surviving these violent episodes. Bill survived being shot twice. Ronnie survived being run down. They were lucky. Betty's next victims wouldn't be. In 1981, Betty's fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, disappeared. One day, he was living in Betty's house near Gun Barrel City, and the next day, he was simply gone. Betty told anyone who asked that Doyle had left her, that he'd packed his things and walked out without saying where he was going. Since Doyle had a criminal record, and was known to move around frequently, nobody questioned Betty's story too closely. No missing person report was ever filed. No investigation was launched. Doyle was just another man who'd left town, and people forgot about him quickly. But Doyle hadn't left. He was buried in Betty's backyard the entire time, his body decomposing under the garage, while Betty went about her life as if nothing had happened. She collected his belongings. She told his family he'd abandoned her. She found another husband to take his place. Life continued, and Doyle's grave remained undiscovered for 4 more years. When investigators finally searched Betty's property in 1985, they found Doyle's skeletal remains right where she'd buried him. He'd been shot in the head with the same .38 caliber pistol that would later kill Betty Lou Beets. The weapon that ended both men's lives belonged to Betty. She'd owned it for years, keeping it handy for whenever she decided another husband had become too much trouble to keep around. Betty was never formally charged with Doyle's murder. By the time his body was discovered, she'd already been convicted of killing Jimmy Don and sentenced to death. Prosecutors didn't need another conviction. But they used Doyle's murder during her trial to establish a pattern of behavior, to show the jury that Jimmy wasn't an isolated incident. Betty had been killing husbands for years, perfecting her system of marriage, murder, and moving on to the next victim. The gathered evidence revealed that Betty targeted older men with steady incomes, government pensions, or life insurance policies. She would marry them, play the devoted wife for a while, and then, when she got tired of them, or when the financial payout seemed worth it, they would disappear. Some survived. Others didn't. For over 20 years, Betty ran this deadly con, and nobody connected the dots until it was far too late. After Jimmy Don Beets disappeared in August 1983, Betty transformed into the perfect grieving widow. She attended memorials held by the Dallas Fire Department. She spoke with reporters about how much she missed her husband. She acted exactly as society expected a devastated spouse to act. But beneath the performance, Betty was calculating her next moves with the same cold precision she'd used to plan Jimmy's murder. The $110,000 life insurance policy occupied Betty's mind. Jimmy had that coverage through his job as a Dallas Fire Department captain, and Betty was named as the beneficiary. But there was a problem. Without a body, Texas law required a 7-year waiting period before Jimmy could be legally declared dead and the insurance paid out. 7 years was a long time to wait, even for someone as patient as Betty. She also stood to receive $20 per month in pension benefits from the fire department. That money would continue for the rest of her life, though. A steady stream of income that would let her live comfortably without working. All she had to do was maintain the illusion that Jimmy had died in a fishing accident, and the money would keep flowing. Betty proved remarkably good at maintaining that illusion. When investigators interviewed her about Jimmy's disappearance, she had answers for every question. Why had Jimmy gone fishing alone that day? He often did that. He loved the solitude of being out on the water by himself. Why didn't he tell her exactly where he was going? He sometimes changed his plans on the water, depending on where the fish were biting. Why had she waited so long to report him missing? She'd assumed he'd decided to stay overnight on the boat, like he sometimes did. Her explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she was lying. She didn't avoid questions or become defensive when pressed for details. She was just a hearing-impaired woman who'd lost her husband in a tragic accident, and everyone felt sorry for her. Meanwhile, Betty continued living in the house where she'd murdered Jimmy. She walked past the wishing well every day, the pretty garden feature that concealed her darkest secret. She tended the flowers around it, watered them during dry spells, made sure everything looked beautiful and well-maintained. Visitors would compliment her gardening skills, never imagining what lay beneath those carefully arranged roses. Less than 6 months before killing Jimmy, Betty had applied for an additional $10,000 life insurance policy in his name through J.C. Penney. She forged Jimmy's signature on the application, something he never would have known about or authorized. Betty directed all correspondence about this policy to her daughter's address instead of her own home, ensuring Jimmy wouldn't accidentally discover what she'd done. This wasn't the action of a woman who feared for her life from an abusive husband. It was the calculated planning of someone preparing to commit murder for profit. Betty sold Jimmy's boat nearly a year after his death, pocketing the money without a second thought. She collected his belongings and distributed them among family members, or sold them. She acted as if Jimmy was really gone, really drowned in Cedar Creek Lake, because that's what she needed everyone to believe. For almost 2 years, Betty's performance never saw a sculpture slipped. She maintained the facade of the grieving widow while secretly waiting for the 7-year period to expire so she could collect the full insurance payout. She calculated that she'd already collected some benefits, and the rest would come in time. All she had to do was be patient and keep playing her part. During this time, Betty dated other men. She moved on with her life while Jimmy's body rotted in the wishing well outside her window. If you believe this story shows a woman who should be held accountable for destroying families and manipulating the system for profit, drop a comment below. What punishment would you have given someone like Betty? She even planted more flowers around the well, making it an even prettier focal point of her garden. Neighbors would stop to admire her work, telling her how lovely the yard looked. Betty would smile and thank them, never hinting at what lay buried beneath their feet. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She'd turned her victim's grave into a decorative showpiece. But Betty had made mistakes. Cold-blooded killers always do eventually. She'd trusted her son Robert to keep the secret, assuming family loyalty would prevent him from ever talking. She'd left Doyle's body buried in a relatively shallow grave under the garage. She'd been too confident in her ability to fool everyone forever. And somewhere out there, someone knew the truth about what had happened to Jimmy Don Beets. That someone was about to come forward. It's spring of the year 1985, nearly 2 years after Jimmy Don Beets' disappearance. An anonymous phone call came into the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. The voice on the other end told investigators something that would blow the case wide open. Jimmy Don Beets hadn't drowned in Cedar Creek Lake. He'd been murdered, and his wife, Betty Lou Beets, was the killer. The caller provided specific details that only someone close to the crime could possibly know. It was an information that was unknown to the public. Investigators took the tip seriously. They reopened Jimmy's case and started looking at Betty with fresh eyes. This time, they weren't viewing her as a grieving widow. They were looking at her as a potential killer. And once they started looking, pieces began falling into place that hadn't made sense before. Why had Betty asked about insurance money so quickly after Jimmy disappeared? Why had she sold his boat? Why did she seem more concerned with financial matters than with finding her husband? The questions that had seemed slightly odd at the time now looked like red flags they'd missed. On June 8, 1985, Henderson County deputies arrested Betty at her home. They also obtained a search warrant for the property, and Betty was forced to watch from the back of a police car as investigators began digging up her yard. She maintained her composure, staying calm and quiet, just as she had throughout the investigation. But this time, her performance wouldn't save her. Investigators started with the decorative wishing well in the front yard. Breaking through the concrete and bricks, they discovered human remains, a body that had been shot twice in the head and carefully buried. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. This was Jimmy Don Beets, the supposedly drowned firefighter who'd been buried in his own front yard the entire time. But investigators weren't satisfied with finding just one body. The anonymous tip had mentioned there might be more. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to search the rest of the property. Behind the house, under an old garage, the dogs alerted to something beneath the concrete slab. When investigators dug beneath the garage, they found another set of human remains, badly decomposed, reduced mostly to bones after 4 years in the ground. This victim had also been shot in the head. Investigators identified the remains as belonging to Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's fourth husband, who'd supposedly left her back in 1981. Like Jimmy, Doyle had never left at all. He'd been murdered and buried on Betty's property, forgotten by everyone except the woman who'd put him there. Ballistics testing revealed both men had been killed with the same weapon, a .38 caliber collector's pistol that belonged to Betty. She'd used the same gun to kill both husbands, keeping it hidden in her house between murders, like some macabre tool she'd pull out whenever needed. The evidence was overwhelming, but prosecutors knew they needed more than just bodies and a weapon to secure a conviction. That's when Robert Branson came forward. Betty's son had been living with the secret of what he'd done for nearly 2 years, and the weight of it had been crushing him. Now, with his mother arrested and the bodies discovered, Robert decided to tell investigators everything. He described the night of August 6, 1983, in devastating detail. How his mother had told him she was going to kill Jimmy. How she'd sent him away while she committed the murder. How he'd returned to find Jimmy dead in the recliner. Robert explained how he'd helped bury the body in the wishing well, how they'd staged the fishing accident, how his mother had stayed calm and calculating throughout the entire process. Robert's testimony was damning, but it came at a cost. By admitting he'd helped dispose of Jimmy's body, Robert implicated himself in the crime. Prosecutors cut him a deal to testify truthfully about everything, and they wouldn't charge him as an accessory to murder. Robert took the deal. He would help send his own mother to death row in exchange for his freedom. Investigators also discovered that Betty's daughter, Shirley Stegner, had been involved in disposing of Doyle Barker's body. Just like Robert. Shirley had helped her mother bury a husband and keep the secret. Betty had turned her own children into accomplices, using family bonds to ensure their silence. But now those same children were turning on her, providing the testimony that would seal her fate. The financial motive became crystal clear during the investigation. Prosecutors discovered that Jimmy had $10,000 in life insurance through the Dallas Fire Department, with Betty named as beneficiary. She also stood to receive $200 per month in pension benefits for the rest of her life. The forged life insurance application for an additional $10,000 policy showed premeditation that Betty had been planning Jimmy's murder for months, setting up financial payouts before she ever pulled the trigger. Prosecutors also looked into Doyle Barker's finances. While his financial situation wasn't as lucrative as Jimmy's, he did have some assets and a small pension. Betty had been collecting Doyle's mail and possibly his benefits for years after killing him, though proving this was difficult given how much time had passed. The evidence painted Betty Lou Beets as a black widow spider who lured men into her web, married them for their money, and killed them when they became inconvenient or when the financial payout justified their murder. She'd perfected this system over decades, learning from each victim how to be more careful, more calculating, more convincing in her lies. Texas prosecutors charged Betty with capital murder for murdering Jimmy Don Beets for remuneration, which meant killing someone for financial gain. This charge carried only two possible sentences under Texas law: death or life in prison without parole. The state was going to make sure Betty Lou Beets never killed another man again. On July 11, 1985, at the 173rd District Court of Henderson County, Texas, Betty Lou Beets walked into the courtroom to face the most serious charge in Texas law, which was capital murder. She was 48 years old, hearing impaired, and about to be judged by 12 of her peers. The prosecution's case seemed overwhelming, but Betty's defense attorneys had a strategy that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Instead of arguing self-defense or claiming years of abuse had driven Betty to murder, her lawyers tried to blame her own children. They suggested that maybe Robert or Shirley had actually killed Jimmy and Doyle, and that Betty was covering for them out of misguided maternal loyalty. It was a desperate, last-ditch argument that insulted the intelligence of everyone present, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. The prosecution built their case methodically, piece by piece. They presented the two bodies found on Betty's property. They showed the jury the .38 caliber pistol that had killed both men. They brought in forensics experts to explain the ballistics evidence, and also presented financial records showing Betty's motives, which included the insurance policies, the pension benefits, and the forged applications for additional coverage. But the prosecution's most powerful weapon was Betty's own son. Robert Branson took the stand and destroyed his mother's defense with his testimony. He described August 6, 1983, in excruciating detail. How Betty had looked him in the eye and told him Jimmy had to die. How she'd sent him away while she committed murder. How he'd returned to find Jimmy's body slumped in the recliner. How they'd buried him in the wishing well together. Robert didn't paint himself as innocent. He admitted his role in disposing of the body and staging the fishing accident. But he made one thing perfectly clear. This was Betty's plan, Betty's decision, Betty's murder. Robert had been a reluctant accomplice, a son too scared of his mother to refuse her demands. The jury could see the pain in Robert's face as he testified against the woman who'd given birth to him. Under cross-examination, Betty's defense attorneys tried to suggest that Robert might have killed Jimmy himself. They implied that maybe he was framing his mother to avoid prosecution. But Robert's testimony was too detailed, consistent, and obviously truthful. He described conversations and planning that only the killer would know about. He knew where Betty had hidden the gun afterward. He remembered exactly what she'd said and how she'd acted before, during, and after the murder. "My mother is a very selfish woman who cares only about money," Robert testified. Betty stared at her son with an expression that witnesses later described as cold and empty. No tears fell from her eyes or emotion on her face. She looked at Robert the same way she'd looked at Jimmy before pulling the trigger, with absolute indifference. Shirley Stegner also testified about helping dispose of Doyle Barker's body. Betty's daughter described how her mother had convinced her to help bury Doyle under the garage, telling her it was necessary, that Doyle had been a bad man who deserved what happened. Shirley had believed her mother at the time, but now she understood the truth. Betty had murdered Doyle just like she'd murdered Jimmy, and she'd manipulated her children into being accomplices. The prosecution presented evidence about Betty's previous husbands. Bill Lane testified about being shot twice by Betty and somehow surviving. Ronnie Threlkeld described how Betty had tried to run him over with her car. Both men painted a picture of a woman with a violent temper who saw murder as a legitimate solution to marital problems. They were the lucky ones. They'd survived Betty's attacks and lived to testify about them. Betty's defense tried to present her as a victim of abuse who'd finally snapped after years of suffering. But they had a critical problem. There was no evidence of abuse. Betty had never filed police reports about being beaten. She'd never sought help from domestic violence organizations. She'd never told doctors or friends about her so-called abuse. Her hospital records showed no pattern of injuries consistent with domestic violence. The only evidence was Betty's word, offered for the first time after she'd been caught murdering her husband. The jury deliberated for less than a day. On October 11, 1985, they returned a verdict that surprised no one. They charged her guilty of capital murder for remuneration. Betty Lou Beets had murdered Jimmy Don Beets for his insurance money and pension benefits, and the jury had no doubt about it. 3 days later, on October 14, 1985, the same jury reconvened for the punishment phase. Under Texas law, they had only two options: death or life in prison without parole. The prosecution argued that Betty was a serial killer who'd murdered at least 2 husbands and would kill again if given the chance. She'd shown no remorse, regret, or humanity. She'd buried men in her yard like garbage and planted flowers over their graves. The defense argued for mercy, claiming Betty had suffered abuse throughout her life and deserved compassion. But their arguments fell flat. Betty had shown no compassion to Jimmy or Doyle. She'd executed them for money and buried them like they weren't real people. Why did she deserve mercy when she'd given none? The jury sentenced Betty Lou Beets to death. She became Texas death row inmate number 810, transferred to the Mountain View unit, where female death row inmates were housed. Betty's reaction to the sentence was the same as her reaction to everything else: cold, calm, and seemingly unbothered by the fact that the state had just sentenced her to die for her crimes. But Betty wasn't giving up. She immediately began the appeals process that would keep her alive for the next 15 years. Betty Lou Beets's first appeal actually succeeded. In 1988, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned her conviction based on a legal technicality. The court ruled that insurance proceeds and pension benefits didn't qualify as remuneration under Texas law, which meant Betty hadn't technically committed capital murder. She'd committed regular murder, which didn't carry an automatic death sentence. Betty thought she'd won. She believed she'd avoided execution. But the state wasn't finished with her. Prosecutors requested a rehearing, arguing that the court had interpreted the law too narrowly. Insurance money was absolutely remuneration. It was payment Betty received in exchange for committing murder. The court reconsidered and reversed its own decision. Betty's conviction was reinstated, and her death sentence stood. For the next 12 years, Betty's case bounced through the court system like a legal pinball. Appeal after appeal, motion after motion, petition after petition. Her lawyers argued every possible angle. The trial was unfair. The evidence was insufficient. The jury instructions were improper. Her lawyers had been incompetent. The judge had made errors. Evidence of abuse should have been admitted. The definition of remuneration was still wrong. The U.S. Supreme Court denied her case in 1989. An execution date was set for November 8, 1999, but Betty received a stay. Another execution date was scheduled for December 6, 1990. Another stay. The pattern repeated itself throughout the 1990s. Execution dates set. Stays granted. Appeals filed. Courts ruling against her. Betty filed federal habeas corpus petitions, claiming her constitutional rights had been violated. She argued that her trial lawyers had been incompetent for not presenting evidence of abuse to the jury. But this argument had a fatal flaw. There was no evidence of abuse to present. Betty had never documented any abuse during her marriages. She'd never sought help. She'd never told anyone at the time that she was being beaten or threatened. The abuse claims only surfaced after her conviction, when Betty desperately needed a reason why she should be spared from execution. Courts viewed these late-breaking allegations with extreme skepticism. If Betty had really been abused for decades, why had she never mentioned it until after being convicted of murder? Why had no one witnessed this abuse? Why were there no medical records, police reports, or contemporaneous complaints? Federal courts denied her appeals, one after another. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld her conviction, finding that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the jury's verdict. The trial had been fair. The lawyers had been competent. The jury had been properly instructed. Betty had received due process at every stage. By 1999, Betty had exhausted virtually all her legal options. The appeals that had kept her alive for 14 years were running out. Courts were no longer finding procedural errors to reverse. The system had reviewed her case from every possible angle and concluded the same thing every time. Betty Lou Beets was guilty of capital murder, and her sentence was appropriate. On February 24, 2000, Betty's execution date was set, and this time, there would be no more stays. Governor George W. Bush, who was running for president at the time, declined to grant clemency. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted unanimously to deny clemency. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Betty's daughters left the hearing devastated, knowing they'd just watched their mother's last hope disappear. On February 24, 2000 in Huntsville, Texas, Betty was transferred from the Mountain View unit to the Huntsville unit, where Texas conducts its executions. She was given the opportunity to request a final meal, a tradition that allows death row inmates to choose whatever they want to eat in their last hours. Betty declined. She didn't want anything. Some saw this as dignity in her final moments. Others saw it as one last attempt to control something when everything else had been taken from her. Throughout the day, Betty met with her attorney and her pastor. She spent time praying, though whether she asked for forgiveness for her crimes or maintained her innocence until the end remains unknown. Her daughters visited, saying their final goodbyes to the woman who'd given birth to them and who'd turned them into accomplices to murder. When asked if she wanted to make a final statement, Betty declined that too. She had no apologies for Jimmy Don Beets' family, no explanations for why she'd murdered 2 husbands and buried them in her yard. No remorse for the lives she'd destroyed and the children she'd left without fathers. Betty Lou Beets would go to her death in silence, taking whatever truth she knew with her. At 6:00 p.m., guards escorted Betty to the death chamber. She was 62 years old, a great-grandmother who looked like she should be baking cookies or attending church services. The execution chamber in Huntsville is a small, clinical room with large windows where witnesses sit to observe justice being carried out. On one side sat Betty's family and supporters. On the other side sat Jimmy Don Beets' family, finally about to see justice served after 17 years of waiting. Jimmy's son, Jamie Beets, watched from the witness room as guards strapped his father's killer to the gurney. Jamie had been waiting for this moment since 1980, when Betty had murdered his father and buried him in a decorative wishing well. He'd testified at her trial. He'd attended her sentencing. He'd followed every appeal, every stay, every legal maneuver that had kept Betty alive for 15 years, while his father remained dead. Betty was asked one final time if she had any last words. She remained silent, her expression blank and unreadable. And once again, No tears fell from her eyes, or emotion crossed her face. According to Jamie, who watched from just feet away, Betty showed absolutely no expression at all. She simply lay there calmly, as if this were just another ordinary day. Betty glanced at her attorney and pastor, offering them a small, peaceful smile. Then she closed her eyes and waited for the end to come. The executioner began the lethal injection process. 3 chemicals would flow into Betty's veins in sequence. First, sodium thiopental to render her unconscious. Then, pancuronium bromide to paralyze her muscles. And finally, potassium chloride to stop her heart. Betty coughed twice as the chemicals entered her bloodstream. She took one sharp, gasping breath. And then she was still. Her chest stopped rising. Her face went slack. The woman who'd murdered at least 2 husbands and fooled everyone for decades was dead. At 6:18 p.m. on February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was pronounced dead. She became only the 2nd woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The first had been Carla Faye Tucker, executed 2 years earlier in 1998. Betty had the distinction of being the oldest woman executed in the United States since 1962, when Arizona executed a woman who was 63 years old. After her execution, Betty's body was cremated. Her ashes were scattered over her mother's grave in North Carolina, the same mother who'd been institutionalized when Betty was 12, leaving Betty to raise her siblings alone. Betty left behind 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. She also left behind 2 confirmed murder victims, countless traumatized family members, and questions that would never be fully answered. Jamie Beets spoke to reporters after watching Betty's execution. She had no expression on her face at all, he said. She just lay there like it was any other day. After 17 years of waiting for justice, Jamie finally had closure. His father's killer was dead, and the legal system had done what it promised to do. But not everyone viewed Betty's execution as justice. Her daughters insisted until the end that their mother had been a victim of abuse who'd finally fought back against her abusers. They claimed Betty had suffered at the hands of every man she married, and that years of trauma had driven her to commit acts she otherwise never would have done. The problem with this narrative is the complete lack of evidence supporting it. Betty never filed police reports about abuse. She never sought help from shelters or counseling services. She never told friends, neighbors, or family members that she was being beaten. Hospital records showed no pattern of injuries consistent with domestic violence. The photographs her daughters presented to the parole board were undated and unverified, appearing only in the final days before Betty's execution. More damning was Betty's pattern of behavior. She didn't just kill one allegedly abusive husband in self-defense. She killed at least 2 husbands under circumstances that showed clear premeditation and planning. She forged insurance documents months before murdering Jimmy. She carefully staged his disappearance to look like a fishing accident. She buried bodies in her yard and planted flowers over their graves. These aren't the actions of a battered woman fighting for survival. They exactly fit the actions of a calculating killer who murdered for profit. Bill Lane and Ronnie Threlkeld survived Betty's attacks, and both testified that they'd never abused her. Yes, Bill admitted to threatening Betty, which is why she'd shot him. But he survived 2 gunshot wounds, and Betty actually remarried him afterward. Would a genuine abuse victim remarry the man who'd supposedly terrorized her? The timeline doesn't support Betty's version of events. The financial motive, however, is crystal clear. Jimmy Don Beets had $110,000 in life insurance and $200 monthly pension benefits. Betty applied for an additional $10,000 policy in Jimmy's name, forging his signature and hiding the paperwork from him. She asked about insurance money within days of Jimmy's disappearance, long before most widows would even think about such practical matters. Money was clearly her motivation, not fear or self-defense. Doyle Wayne Barker's murder reinforces this pattern. Betty killed him in 1981, buried him under her garage, and told everyone he'd left her. She collected his possessions and benefits for years afterward. There's no evidence Doyle ever abused Betty, no justification offered for his death. He simply became inconvenient, so Betty eliminated him and moved on to her next victim. The question that haunts investigators is whether Betty killed more victims than the two they found. She married 6 times and had violent confrontations with at least 4 of these husbands. 2 ended up buried in her yard. 2 others survived murder attempts. What about the remaining husbands? Did they die natural deaths, or did Betty perfect her technique after killing Doyle and get better at disposing of bodies? Robert Franklin Branson, Betty's first husband and the father of 6 of her children, died in 1980. His death was attributed to natural causes at the time, but given what we now know about Betty, some investigators wondered if he'd actually been murdered. No investigation was ever launched, though, and Robert's body was buried without any suspicion of foul play. Betty's case raises uncomfortable questions about the death penalty that continue to divide people today. Was executing a 62-year-old great-grandmother justice or cruelty? Does it matter that she looked like everyone's sweet grandmother when her crimes were so cold-blooded? Should claims of abuse, even unsupported ones, be enough to spare someone from execution? Drop a comment of what you think about this case below. I would love to read them. Supporters of Betty's execution point to the overwhelming evidence of her guilt. 2 bodies buried in her yard, the murder weapon in her possession, her own son's testimony about how she'd planned and executed the killings, the forged insurance documents showing premeditation, the complete lack of any evidence supporting her abuse claims. Betty murdered husbands for money, and she did it multiple times. The death penalty exists for exactly these kinds of calculating, cold-blooded killers. Opponents of the death penalty argue that executing anyone, even someone as guilty as Betty, makes the state complicit in murder. They point to the fact that she was a woman, that she was elderly, that she'd been on death row for 15 years. They argue that life in prison would have been sufficient punishment, that killing Betty didn't bring Jimmy or Doyle back, that it only created one more death to add to the tragedy. The debate over domestic violence adds another layer of complexity. If Betty really had been abused, and we'll never know for certain, does that change how we should view her crimes? Battered women do sometimes kill their abusers, and courts have recognized this as legitimate self-defense in some cases. But Betty's killings don't fit the pattern of defensive violence. She didn't shoot Jimmy during an assault, or while he was threatening her. She executed him in cold blood while he dozed in his recliner. She planned his death weeks in advance. She staged an elaborate cover-up. These are premeditated murders, not desperate acts of self-defense. Texas has executed more people than any other state since the death penalty was reinstated, and the state shows no signs of slowing down. Betty Lou Beets was just one of hundreds put to death in Huntsville. Her case was notable primarily because she was a woman. Female executions are rare, making up less than 2% of all executions nationwide. But her gender didn't save her. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too precise, the lack of genuine remorse too obvious. Jimmy Don Beets was 46 years old when Betty murdered him. He'd served the Dallas Fire Department for years, rising to the rank of captain through hard work and dedication. His fellow firefighters described him as a good man who loved fishing and spending time outdoors. He'd married Betty believing he'd found a partner to share his life with. Instead, he found a killer who saw him as nothing more than a paycheck worth $110,000. Jimmy left behind children who had to grow up without a father. His son Jamie spent 17 years waiting for justice, attending every hearing and appeal, never giving up hope that Betty would finally pay for her crimes. The Beets family had to endure not just Jimmy's murder, but the knowledge that he'd been buried in a decorative wishing well in his own front yard, that his killer had tended flowers over his grave, that Betty had fooled everyone for nearly 2 years. Doyle Wayne Barker was largely forgotten in the aftermath of Betty's trial. Because prosecutors never formally charged Betty with his murder, Doyle became a footnote in true crime history. But he was a real person with his own family and life. Betty killed him in 1981 and buried him under her garage like he was garbage. For 4 years, she lived in that house knowing Doyle's body was decomposing beneath her feet. She never showed remorse, never acknowledged what she'd done, until investigators forced her to confront the evidence. Robert Branson and Shirley Stegner both had to live with the knowledge that they'd helped their mother commit murder. Robert assisted in burying Jimmy in the wishing well and staging the fishing accident. Shirley helped dispose of Doyle's body under the garage. Both children testified against Betty at trial, helping send their own mother to death row in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The psychological damage Betty inflicted on her children is incalculable. She manipulated them into becoming accomplices to murder, using maternal bonds and family loyalty to ensure their silence. When Robert finally told the truth, he had to face the fact that he'd been complicit in his stepfather's death. That guilt would follow him for the rest of his life, even though prosecutors had granted him immunity. Betty's other children, the ones who defended her until the end, had to reconcile loving their mother with knowing she was a serial killer. They insisted she'd been abused, that she'd been a victim, that she'd deserved mercy instead of execution. But deep down, they must have known the truth, that their mother had murdered at least 2 husbands and buried them in her yard. She'd collected insurance money and pension checks while her victims rotted in shallow graves. She'd played them all for fools. The true crime community remains fascinated by Betty Lou Beets because she defies easy categorization. She wasn't a young, attractive woman like some famous female killers. She wasn't mentally ill or obviously disturbed. She looked like everyone's grandmother, hearing-impaired, unassuming, the kind of woman you'd see at church or the grocery store and never think twice about. This ordinariness makes her crimes even more chilling. Betty proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can look like ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary houses. They can smile at neighbors and plant flowers and attend family gatherings while hiding bodies in their backyards. The disconnect between Betty's appearance and her actions reminds us that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it hides behind the most mundane disguises. Her case also highlighted how easy it was for a serial killer to operate for decades without detection. Betty murdered Doyle in 1981 and Jimmy in 1983, and nobody connected the dots until an anonymous tip forced investigators to look closer. If that phone call had never come, Betty might have continued killing. Her system was working. Marry older men with money, murder them when convenient, collect the benefits, and move on to the next victim. She'd perfected the routine over 20 years. The identity of the anonymous tipster was never publicly revealed. Someone close to Betty, Perhaps one of her children, a family member, or a friend, finally had enough and called authorities. That single phone call saved potential future victims and brought justice for Jimmy and Doyle. But whoever made that call had to live with the knowledge that they'd known or suspected the truth and had waited years before coming forward. Like and subscribe if you believe killers like Betty should never be able to hide behind false claims of abuse. People who make excuses for calculated murderers won't. Betty Lou Beets spent 15 years on death row, from 1980 to 2000. During that time, she never once admitted guilt. She never apologized to Jimmy's family or Doyle's family. She never showed genuine remorse for the lives she'd destroyed. Instead, she maintained her innocence and blamed others. She said her lawyers were incompetent, that the jury was biased, that her children were lying, and that her husbands had abused her. This lack of remorse ultimately sealed her fate. Courts might have shown more mercy to a defendant who acknowledged wrongdoing and expressed genuine regret. But Betty refused to take responsibility for her actions, right up until her final moments. When given the chance to speak before her execution, she chose silence. No apologies or explanations, just a small smile for her attorney and pastor before closing her eyes and waiting for death. The execution chamber witnesses described Betty as eerily calm as the lethal injection took effect. Most death row inmates show some emotion in their final moments, such as fear, sadness, anger, or regret. But Betty showed nothing. She simply lay there as the chemicals stopped her heart, displaying the same cold indifference she'd shown when murdering her husbands. In a way, her emotionless death mirrored her emotionless crimes. Texas had executed a serial killer, but the execution didn't undo the damage Betty had caused. Jimmy Don Beets was still dead, buried in a wishing well by the woman whom he had shared marriage vows with. Doyle Wayne Barker was still dead, forgotten under a garage floor. Their families still carried the trauma of losing loved ones to a calculating killer who'd viewed murder as a practical solution to ending her financial struggles. The case of Betty Lou Beets serves as a reminder of several disturbing truths. First, that anyone is capable of murder given the right circumstances and motivations. Betty wasn't born evil. She was born into difficult circumstances that shaped her into someone capable of cold-blooded killing. Whether that makes her less culpable or simply explains how she became a monster is a question each person must answer for themselves. Second, that financial motives drive many murders. Betty killed for insurance money and pension benefits. She calculated the cost-benefit analysis of murder and decided the payoff was worth the risk. This kind of killing, murder for profit, is often viewed as more heinous than crimes of passion because it demonstrates such callous disregard for human life. People become nothing more than walking paychecks to be cashed in when convenient. Third, that family dynamics can enable terrible crimes. Betty's children helped her dispose of bodies and maintain the lies that kept her free. They were manipulated by someone they should have been able to trust. This exploitation of family bonds shows how deeply Betty's corruption ran. She didn't just kill strangers or acquaintances. She killed men who'd trusted her enough to marry her, and she made her own children accomplices to murder. Fourth, that claims of abuse, while serious and deserving of investigation, can also be weaponized by guilty people seeking to avoid responsibility. Betty raised allegations of abuse only after being convicted of murder. She produced no contemporaneous evidence, no documentation, no witnesses to corroborate her claims. This doesn't mean all abuse claims are false, far from it. But it does mean courts must carefully evaluate the timing evidence and credibility of such claims, especially when they only surface after conviction. Finally, Betty's case demonstrates that evil doesn't always announce itself obviously. She looked like a harmless grandmother. She was hearing impaired, which made her seem vulnerable rather than dangerous. Neighbors liked her. She kept a nice garden and planted pretty flowers around her yard. This ordinary appearance allowed Betty to hide in plain sight, murdering husbands and burying them while everyone around her remained oblivious to the truth. The wishing well where Jimmy Don Beets was buried has long since been destroyed. The house where Betty lived was sold to new owners, who had to live with the knowledge that bodies had been buried on their property. The physical evidence of Betty's crimes has been erased from the landscape, but the emotional scars remain for everyone touched by her murderous spree. What do you think? Did Betty Lou Beets deserve the judgment she received, or would it have been better if she was handed a life sentence? Drop a comment below. I would like to read your opinion.
I want to thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what's coming next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for instant updates on our latest videos. See you in the next one.